Canada is the only country in the developed world to increase the carbon tax during an affordability crisis. Even Japan got with the program and cancelled its plan to increase the carbon tax. The Liberals keep raising the tax, yet emissions keep going up, and they haven't hit a single emission reduction target. Even the Governor of the Bank of Canada said, axe the carbon tax and the Liberal inflation will be reduced. So why won't the Liberals stop forcing their failed carbon tax scheme on Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, last week we heard really good news for Atlantic Canadians. 3 Atlantic provinces are going to get access to the climate action rebate. That's going to put more money in their pockets, Mr. Speaker. But even more good news, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to flow into Atlantic Canada to transition from dirty, expensive fuel oil to cleaner forms of energy. Heat pumps rule, Mr. Speaker. We're making life more affordable and fighting climate change.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, that is a tax plan and not a climate plan. Their failed plan is sending more Canadians into the food bank, more families that have to skip meals. They keep on failing on the environment, they haven't fixed the economy, and they keep on charging Canadians even more. So why won't the Liberals get out of the way, give Canadians a break, and axe the tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Conservatives never met an environmental program that they didn't want to cut. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned last day that they gutted our environmental laws. They cut $350 million from the climate action budget. Mr. Speaker, for 10 long years, they did absolutely nothing on climate change, Mr. Speaker. We're on track to meet our emissions target. We're doing something about climate change. We're building the economy of tomorrow.
Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
The Liberal carbon tax has driven up the cost of home heating, fuel and groceries. Canadians are suffering. People are wearing their winter coats inside of their homes just to keep down heating costs. Mothers are diluting their baby's milk just to stretch it. And yet, Canada pitifully lacks and ranks 58 out of 63 countries for climate action. Will the Liberal government stop forcing their failed climate tax on suffering Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, I really find it quite rich coming from the party opposite who promised a climate plan and we haven't delivered. They haven't delivered because I can tell you the people in my riding, they want action on climate right now. The impacts of Fiona are still being felt on the ground. Now add not only to the damage done to personal homes, to infrastructure and wastewater, municipal infrastructure, add 4 feet of snow to that, Mr. Speaker. My constituents want action on climate now.
The Honourable Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
I remind the Liberal government that they are in government. They need to present a plan. This government lacks credibility when it has not met a single climate target. A tax on the backs of average Canadians does nothing to drive down emissions. It drives up poverty. More Canadians are relying on food banks than ever before. The food banks fear that they are going to run out of food. The carbon tax is not an environmental plan. It is a tax plan. Will this government cancel their cruel carbon tax on gas, groceries, and home heating?
The tax. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, and yes, we are in government, and we are in government in part because we actually have a credible plan on climate. I think Canadians actually expect from His Majesty's official opposition to have a climate plan, which they clearly do not. Mr. Speaker, affordability today is critically important, but so is affordability tomorrow. We cannot leave the kinds of costs to our children that we will if we do not address climate change. The Climate Institute estimates $100 billion a year by 2050 if we do not act to mitigate carbon emissions. We are going to do so in a manner that will promote economic opportunity and address climate change.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, inflation is hitting hard in the pocketbooks of all Canadian families. Everything is more expensive. As a result, meanwhile, the government is looking to raise the Liberal carbon tax. There's one thing they need to understand. When you raise taxes in times of inflation, it pays off for the government, but not for taxpayers. When will the government finally make the right decision and scrap the carbon tax hike in these inflationary times? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to focus on the issue of affordability to help Canadians deal with. We need to take into account the costs of climate change, adaptation. Those costs will be in the order of $25 billion by 2025. In dealing with the question of affordability, we have to also tackle the question of climate change. Thank you. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. And it's certainly not by attacking Canadians' pocketbooks that the climate problem is going to be solved. This minister, the Prime Minister rather, has made a name for himself with some harebrained economic theories like budgets balance themselves or that SMEs are being used for tax evasion. Ridiculous economic theories. But this is the first time a head of state has ever said it's a good idea to raise taxes in a period of inflation. So, is there anyone in this government who can stand up and say when they're going to scrap the carbon tax hike in times of inflation? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I find it interesting that my honourable colleague has raised the question of absurd economic theories put forward by Canadian politicians, because the most harebrained theory we've heard was the Conservative leader's recommendation that Canadians fight inflation by investing in crypto. That was a crazy idea and a dangerous one. And this is the time for all Canadians to smarten up.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government's carbon tax will increase the price on gas, diesel, and home heating fuel. It'll also increase the price we all pay for groceries, clothing, building materials, and school supplies. And of course, it will force many businesses to pass these costs on to consumers. An analysis done reveals that Nova Scotians will pay $2,000 more a year in 2025 and $3,100 more in 2030. Atlantic Canadians cannot afford this Liberal government's carbon tax plan. When will this Liberal government stop forcing Atlantic Canadians to accept their terrible plan?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
The member talks about a terrible plan. I'll tell you what a terrible plan is not taking action on climate change. His communities and mine are both still dealing with homeowners who are cleaning up the debris in their backyards. His community and mine are both dealing with farms that have had silos torn down and farmers who are more than $100,000 out of pocket so they can feed their cattle this season. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to do what we can to reduce pollution because it's the right thing to do, but we found a way to make sure that homeowners and families are left better off. 8 out of 10 families are left better off. We also introduced a new plan that will have $5,000 upfront grants so people can reduce their power bills by installing heat pumps. It's confounding to understand why he can't support something so simple.
Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting. Perhaps the member should go speak to his own premier, who's asking Canadians to weigh in on the Liberals' punishing carbon tax on Nova Scotians. We all know the tax is going to disproportionately affect low and middle-income families and will cost as much as 14 cents or more a litre at the pumps. The No Carbon Tax for Nova Scotia petition is asking Nova Scotians to support Made in Nova Scotia plan that builds on our climate leadership, safeguards to our environment, and protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. Will this Liberal government stop forcing their failed carbon tax plan on Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister.
Protecting the pocketbooks of Nova Scotia. And I found it interesting to have him explain to his constituents why he's voted against making sure that low-income families can afford to send their kids to the dentist. I find it interesting why he's not putting out social media posts about today's announcement that child care fees are going to be reduced by 50%. I find it interesting that he voted against a $500 supplement for low-income renters. The reality is, every step of the way since we formed government in 2015, we've had the interest of working-class and middle-class Canadians at heart. That'll continue to be the case. We just don't have to pollute to make sure people are better off. We can protect the environment and protect the economy at the same time.
Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
I tell you what's interesting, Nova Scotia Power does not allow homes to have a heat pump as their only source of heat. I'll tell you what's interesting is that home inspectors and insurance companies in Nova Scotia won't allow heat pumps as their only source of heat. And you know why? Because the Canada Building Code prohibits them from doing so because they have to maintain a house at 20 degrees or more, which they cannot do in cold weather. So I will ask this government, will they stop their fairy tale programs and stop forcing Nova Scotians to pay for their unhelpful and
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Watson, it's a good thing Sherlock is on the case. We would never have figured this out. Holy smokes, it's unbelievable, but somebody could have a heat pump and some other source of heating as well. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is we have a new $5,000 grant. There will be an upfront payment directly to homeowners that is going to allow them to save thousands of dollars every year. It would help reduce pollution in our communities.
I'm going to have order. I just want to remind the honourable members, the protocol is you ask a question and you listen. You can't hear the answer if you're shouting. The Honourable Minister of Immigration, he's got about 15 seconds left if he wants to finish off that thought.
In 15 seconds, I will simply say, Mr. Speaker, we have found a way to save people money and reduce pollution. That's a good thing. If the Conservatives agree, I invite them to support us.
The Honourable Member for Coastal Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, between the monthly increase in mortgage payments, the price of groceries, gas to drive to work, and the cost to heat their homes, Atlantic Canadians don't know where to turn. Yet, the Maine minister from Newfoundland and Labrador says he's sick and tired of them complaining about the cold winter. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to keep the heat on this cold-hearted minister. And I implore him to beg his old buddy, the Prime Minister, to not force this carbon tax plan down the throats of Atlantic Canadians.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, to be given yet another opportunity to tell the family of 4 in Newfoundland and Labrador that they will be receiving $1,312 in cold hard cash directly to their bank account 4 times a year. That's $328 starting in July, another $328 just when they're getting ready for the winter in October, and another $328 come January. I will take that as cold-heartedness. No, I will take that as good money. Cold, hard cash, Mr. Speaker.